Hello there, you're watching Al 24 News live from Algiers. I'm your host, Karim Fazakari, and here are today's headlines. After 3 years, mainland China opens sea and land crossings and ends a requirement for incoming travelers to quarantine. Also in our news, polls close in Benin parliamentary elections, seen as a test of democracy as opposition candidates take part after a 4-year absence. Biden makes first trip as president to U.S.-Mexico border as administration imposes restrictions on asylum seekers. Also coming up, shortly after the ceasefire ended, fierce shelling and fire exchanges have resumed between Russia and Ukraine. Hello again and welcome to the program. First in our news, clashes erupted by Zionist occupation forces in north of Hebron, West Bank, leaving a Palestinian injured and dozens suffocating. According to the Palestinian news agency, the clashes erupted after a march in the town that demands the return of martyr Ahmed al-Khalil body, who was detained 2 years ago. Still with Palestine, Palestinian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates Riyad al-Maliki stated that the Palestinian leadership is considering a legal and political response to the vindictive measures recently announced by the far-right Zionist leadership against the Palestinian people. On Friday, the Zionist entity ordered the transferring of nearly $39 million from Palestinian Authority tax funds to the so-called Israeli victims of terrorism in response to Palestine's pursuit at the UN General Assembly of an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the Zionist occupation.
The Israeli occupation's measures violate international law and come in response to the state of Palestine's natural and legal right to get rid of the decades-long occupation. In an identical letter to foreign ministers around the world, we will call for a clear position on these measures so that the occupying power, Israel, will realize that it's not fully free to act as it pleases.
To a different news now. In Libya, meetings and consultations continue in search of consensus and national reconciliation, with Tripoli hosting preparatory meetings for the National Reconciliation Conference overseen by the Libyan Presidential Council under African auspices. Concurrently, the United Nations mission is preparing to hold a separate meeting between the presidents of the House of Representatives, Akila Saleh, and President of the Supreme Council of State, Khalid al-Mushri, to discuss ways to accelerate the creation of a constitutional platform for general elections.
The Libyan Presidential Council has never been part of the problem, and it has stood firm at an equal distance from all parties that struggle for power, which it was never one of those who clung to it or competed for it. The Presidential Council has committed itself to its mission to create the political, legal and social grounds for reconciliation, and we have made and are still making every effort and time for this goal.
To Western Sahara now, the committees emerging from the National Preparatory Conference for the 16th Congress of the Polisario Front began on Saturday their work in order to unify the perception and visions on all the issues discussed in the local conferences under the supervision of the Preparatory Committee for the 16th Congress at the level of all extensions of the branches of the political organization. All the way to Algeria now, President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, chaired on Sunday a cabinet meeting in which he valued the bill related to the prevention and fight against human trafficking after its approval by the cabinet. President Tebboune considered the draft text an added value and a reinforcement of legal text in the field of human rights protection. The French newspaper L'Humanité has published an investigation into the Morocco Gate resounding corruption scandal within the European Parliament, in which it returns to the policy of influence deployed by Rabat at the heart of the European institutions, bribing MPs in return for their alignment with the interests of the Makhzen regime. The investigation, published under the title From Brussels to Paris, The Friends of the Moroccan King, goes back to behind the scenes of what is already considered one of the biggest corruption scandals to have rocked European institutions. The 46 Ivory Coast soldiers who were sentenced to 20 years in Mali returned to their homeland after Malian president pardoned them, in addition to building better ties between African neighboring countries. Sofiane Kenturi has more details.
The 46 Ivorian military detained in Mali returned to Abidjan on Saturday at midnight, where they were welcomed by President Alassane Ouattara and the entire government. Ivorian president appreciated the soldiers' effort during their hard operation in Mali, which took them 6 months to return to their country and their family.
You have nothing to reproach yourself for, as the Minister of Defense said. You were going on a mission. It was moreover the 8th rotation in 6 months. The mission was not easy, but you're back exactly 6 months after your departure from the Ivory Coast.
Soldiers also were grateful to the president's effort in demanding the neighboring country Mali to release them, and the insistence of the government even after Bamako missed the January 1st deadline, which was made by West African countries.
I'm very happy to return to my native land. It was our wish. Today, with His Excellency, the President of the Republic, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, has made his efforts so that we can find our families and our native land.
The 49 soldiers, including 3 defendant women, were detained in July when they went to work for Sahelian Aviation Services, private company contracted to work in Mali by the United Nations. By pardoning the Ivorian soldiers, the Malian government stated that such a decision symbolizes Goita's concern for good governance and respect for independent justice.
In Africa still, over 6 million Beninese people have headed to polls on Sunday as part of the legislative elections in the country. People are allowed for the first time in a long period to vote for opposition parties, which represent 3 out of 4 parties. The opposition group, the Democrats, have been allowed to participate in the vote for the very first time by the government of the President Patrice Talon.
The member of the parliament I am voting for has made many promises and we want them to be kept. Our children only have to find a job. They have to go to the university for 1 or 2 years and then they end up at home to sell communication units or to drive a motorcycle cab. We don't want that anymore.
Still with different matter now, at least 40 people were killed Sunday and many others seriously injured in a bus crash in central Senegal. The incident involved 2 buses that collided with one another. According to the Senegalese president, the Western African nation will observe 3 days of national mourning for the victims, starting from January 9th. For its part, Algeria offered its sincere condolences following the serious traffic accident, expressing its sympathy and solidarity with Senegal, according to a statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nigerian railway authorities on Sunday announced the closure of a train station in southern state of Edo until further notice after an armed attack on Saturday. Nigerian police stated that a group of gunmen gained entry into the Egwibin train station in Edo State on Saturday, and began to shoot sporadically in the air before abducting scores of passengers waiting to be conveyed to Warri, a city in the neighboring Delta State. The police have launched an operation to arrest the fleeing gunmen and rescue the abducted victims.
As I speak, people are in the field all over the place. Vigilance, security agencies, and other people. Everybody is concerned, but we have to be careful with what divulge so that we won't jeopardize the process we're doing. As for the category of people kidnapped, some of them are from Igibin, while others are passengers from other places. And as for the number, for now, we're looking at over 30, but we can only give comprehensive number when preliminary investigations are concluded.
According to Iran's official news agency IRNA, a shooting attack occurred at an oil and gas company in southwestern Iran, which killed 1 person and injured 2 people. According to the report, an armed employee of an oil and gas producing company in the country carried out the attack by breaking into the office's chemical department and opening fire on the staff. The attacker was detained by police as he tried to flee the scene. Shortly after the ceasefire ended, fierce shelling and fire exchanges have resumed between Russia and Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry stated that it had killed 600 Ukrainian soldiers in its last strikes, which took place in the east of Ukraine. Here's Osama Ayadi's report.
Shortly after the ceasefire ordered by the Russian president was over, fighting has resumed to many regions of the Ukrainian territory. Russia's defense ministry revealed on Sunday that it had killed more than 600 Ukrainian servicemen in a massive rocket strike on buildings in eastern Ukraine temporarily housing Ukrainian forces. The strike on Kramatorsk was revenge for Ukraine's deadly attack earlier this year on Russian barracks in Makiivka, in part of the Donetsk region controlled by Moscow's forces.
Over the past 24 hours, Russian intelligence service has discovered and reliably confirmed through several independent channels the temporary deployment points of the Ukrainian forces in Kramatorsk. There were over 700 Ukrainian servicemen in dorm number 28 and over 600 servicemen in dorm number 47. More than 600 Ukrainian servicemen have been killed in a massive rocket attack on these locations of temporary deployment of the Ukrainian forces units.
Russia's defense ministry released a video showing their gun crews inflicting fire on the armed forces of Ukraine's manpower and armored vehicles, fuel and munition depots. The ministry said the action was part of the counter-battery warfare, the artillerymen identifying and destroying Ukrainian howitzer and reactive batteries at long range. At another level, leaders of the United States and Germany announced in a joint statement on Thursday that they were sending armored fighting vehicles to Ukraine, ramping up military support for Kyiv to repel Russian forces after a similar move by France earlier this week.
President Biden announced additional support, military support also, in armored vehicles like the Bradley fighting vehicles, so that we can give the Ukrainian forces the ability not only to break through lines, but to exploit the breakthrough.
On the northern region of Ukraine, Russia and Belarus have beefed up their joint military group in Belarus with weapons, soldiers, and specialized equipment, and plan to hold joint aviation drills.
Looking at the Russian servicemen, you realize that those guys took part in something, that they have some experience, or someone passed this experience on to them.
Ukraine has repeatedly warned that President Vladimir Putin may try to use Belarus to launch a new ground invasion of Ukraine from the north, a step that would open a major new front in the special military operation.
And in related news, both Russia and Ukraine said on Sunday that they had taken part in another prisoner swap, with 50 servicemen returning home on each side. The Russian Defense Ministry shared footage of what it said were swapped Russian prisoners getting on buses and being handed out items by officials. The head of the Ukrainian presidential administration, Andriy Yermak, also shared footage on his Telegram channel of what he said were swapped Ukrainian prisoners. To a different development, Sweden and Finland received relatively happy news. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, underlined on the importance for the two countries to join NATO. Sweden has not received the confirmation support from Ankara to join the military alliance yet. The Swedish foreign minister stated that his country is confident that Ankara would provide the necessary support. However, he put in focus the conditions Ankara has set for its support.
I expect so. I will not guarantee the exact date, because this is, of course, at the end of the day, has to be a sovereign decision by the Turkish and actually the Hungarian parliament, because there are two parliaments that haven't yet ratified. But I hope, and I will continue to work for also ratification in those two parliaments. Finland and Sweden have delivered on that agreement and also committed clearly to have a long-term cooperation with Turkey on these issues. So therefore, the time has come to finalize the accession process and to ratify the accession protocol.
To another topical news now. International travelers started arriving in Shanghai airport as China lifted the mandatory quarantine for people arriving from abroad. The first people to arrive expressed their relief from not having to undergo these measures, which were an integral part of life in zero-COVID China. Islam Sid has the story.
Mainland China opened its doors to the world after 3 years and ended the mandatory quarantine for incoming travelers. Travelers have flocked to China by air, land and sea on Sunday, eager for long-awaited reunions. Families and friends exchanged emotional hugs and greetings with travelers, with some having been separated from them since the pandemic.
Daughter is coming in today because there's no quarantine. So we're just thrilled that China has done away with the quarantine policy.
Left China at the beginning of December. I was anticipating coming back, being flown to Shenyang instead of Beijing, and spending 8 days on my own in a hotel room and having to go through all the tests and all the protocols and everything else that was involved. So,
according to the government, there will be about 2 billion travelers this season, which is almost twice as many as in 2018, and back to levels that were seen in 2019. However, the easing of border restrictions critics said it is a lack of transparency from Beijing because it comes at a time of COVID outbreak in the country.
初步分析研判，
This year's Lunar New Year travel rush will start on 7 January and end on 15th February, a total of 40 days. Compared with previous years, this year's Lunar New Year travel rush will be the most uncertain, complex and challenging one in recent years, as the peak of passenger flow and the peak of the pandemic overlap.
China ended a zero-COVID policy that had curbed the virus surge locally, but also cut Beijing's off from the rest of the world and damaged the world's second biggest economy. But more foreign governments, mainly EU states, are imposing testing requirements on travelers from China, which the latter had protested against.
At a COVID-19 antigen kit factory in central China, protesters and police engaged in physical altercations. According to online users, the protest was in response to low pay and the firing of several workers by the factory's manufacturer. According to a summary of the World Bank's Global Economic Prospects report, there is a risk of a generalized global recession in 2023, with small states, particularly the vulnerable ones, suffering the most. Here's Selma Nasib.
Expressing real fears, the World Bank warned in its latest report that the world is really leading into recession this year. It is worried about further adverse shocks that could affect mainly vulnerable economies.
The World Bank is concerned that further adverse shocks could push the global economy into recession in 2023, with small states especially vulnerable.
According to the same source, this might cause a risky slowdown in the global growth and a rising rate of inflation. Even without another crisis, global growth this year is expected to decelerate sharply, reflecting Sankula's policy tightening aimed at containing very high inflation, worsening financial conditions, and continued disruptions from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Global growth this year is expected to decelerate sharply, reflecting synchronous policy tightening aimed at containing very high inflation, worsening financial conditions, and continued disruptions from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The current situation pushes officials and decision makers to find a quick and sustainable solutions and to the recovery of the economy.
Urgent global and national efforts are needed to mitigate the risk of such a downturn, as well as debt distress in emerging market and developing economies, where investment growth is expected to remain below the average of the past 2 decades, the Washington-based lender said.
Indeed, the world is bracing for a new crisis, as 1/3 of the global economy will be in recession because of the US, the EU, and China are all slowing down at the same time.
U.S. President Joe Biden made his first trip to the U.S.-Mexico border on Sunday, almost 2 years after taking office. Biden traveled to El Paso, Texas, following his announcement of new plans to block migrants from Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua at the U.S.-Mexico border on Thursday, expanding the nationalities of migrants who can be sent back to Mexico. The new rules will also include offering humanitarian parole for up to 30,000 people a month from those 4 countries if they apply online and find a financial sponsor.
You see in El Paso, we're a very welcoming community. We're a community that's based upon friendship, that's based upon immigration. To be from El Paso literally means to be from the past. El Paso is called El Paso Norte, the Paso of the North. And immigration and understanding people coming through our community to work for a better life, to look for a better life, is something that's ingrained into our DNA here.
And in a different development, the annual January drill featured about 1,000 soldiers from Japan's 1st Airborne Brigade. Japanese paratroopers were dropped from transport planes and were supported by helicopters after landing. Japan's Ground Self-Defense Force said British and Australian troops helped in the drill for the first time, along with 70 US military members. Japan said the participation was part of Tokyo's efforts to strengthen cooperation among its military partners. Climate activists vowed on Sunday to protect a small German village from being bulldozed in order to expand a nearby coal mine, which has become a flashpoint in the conflict between the government and environmental activists. The company says it needs the coal to ensure Germany's energy security, which has come under strain following the cut in gas supplies from Russia since the start of the military operation in Ukraine.
It's overwhelming what kind of picture people are painting here right now of a resistant civil society that knows if we want there to be less crisis one day, then we have to get loud. Then we all have to stand up from all generations. This concerns all of us here. This concerns me, no more than anyone else in this country.
Following violent storm system that killed 6 people last week and left thousands of people without power, California is preparing for another round of strong storms this weekend. Authorities have issued warnings of more heavy rain, strong winds and snow, as well as the flooding, mudslides and rapid river rises that will follow. Supporters of Brazil's former President Jair Bolsonaro broke through a blockade set up by security forces and invaded ministries and the Congress building in Brasilia on Sunday. Protesters also invaded the parking lot of the Plantalo Palace. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, meanwhile, is on an official trip in São Paulo state. And for more stories that are making headlines globally, here is the news in brief.
Hundreds of people from communities cut off by once-in-century floods in Australia's northwest were rescued. Scenes of water covering some places as far as the eye could see were common. This comes as severe weather that brought heavy rain hit the country.
Almost 200 Rohingya refugees landed on the shores of Indonesia's Aceh province on Sunday, following hundreds who arrived late last year, causing desperate conditions in refugee camps in Bangladesh. Most of them are women and children.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his Colombian counterpart Gustavo Petro conferred bilateral investment and trade at a Caracas meeting on Saturday. The discussion centered on similar topics as when they first met in October: management of a newly reopened border, efforts to increase trade, and the peace talks that Bogota is holding with rebel group, the National Liberation Army.
According to Mexican authorities, about 100 Venezuelans who had crossed by land into the United States were expelled to Mexico. The United States said on Thursday that it would expand restrictions to rapidly expel Cuban, Nicaraguan and Haitian migrants caught illegally crossing the border.
And finally in our news, virtual reality headsets are everywhere at CES in Las Vegas, but some stand out, such as the one presented by an American company with a small device placed under the nose, which allows the user to smell the odors of virtual environments: scent of bouquet of roses, smell of roasted marshmallow, scents of forest after the rain. A further step towards the metaverse.
So we have a small wearable that goes in front of the nose, and it doesn't touch the nose, and it releases very small, precise amounts of smell that are triggered by your digital experience. In VR, for example, you might be smelling a rose, and if you hold the rose at arm's length, you don't smell it, but as you bring the rose closer to your nose, you begin to smell it.
And with this, our news comes to a close. For more, do visit our social media platforms. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.